We've seen total revenue, but now let's look at average and marginal revenue. First, let's look at average revenue, or revenue per unit of output sold. The first thing to note about average revenue is that it's simultaneously the price of the product. Imagine that we were selling a product at $5 each unit. What would be the revenue per unit? Well, if the price were always $5 per unit, then the firm's revenue per unit is always going to be $5 as well. In fact, we can prove very simply that price and average revenue are always the same by doing a little bit of simple algebra. So here we have average revenue, revenue per unit, calculated by the total revenue earned divided by the total quantity sold. This will give us the revenue per unit, which is simple enough. But then we can think to ourselves, well, how do we calculate total revenue? Well, total revenue is the price of the product times the quantity sold. And then we realize, well, price times quantity divided by quantity, and cancel out the Q's, and that gives us just P by itself. So the average revenue equals the price. They're always the same amount of money, but from the perspective of the consumer, we're talking about the price of the product, the price per unit. From the perspective of the firm, that amount of money is the revenue per unit. Let's assume we're dealing with a price taker now. Our price taker is a firm which simply has to accept whatever the market price is, and it can sell whatever quantity it produces at the market price. Let's say we're given the total revenue data. What would be the revenue per unit, or average revenue, or in other words, the price? Well, total revenue divided by the output gives us the average revenue. So we can easily calculate that. And it turns out that it's $350 at every level of output. This is our price taker. Let's look at that on a graph. Pretty straightforward. There's our average revenue curve, or our price line if you like. But what if we assume we're dealing now with a price maker instead? So let's say our total revenue, we calculate our total revenue at every level of output, from 0 to 15, as these amounts here. Well, in that case, again, calculating to calculate the average revenue, or the price per unit, it's the total revenue divided by the quantity sold. And then we can see at each level of output, the price, or average revenue, falls. So if we draw a graph of this curve, we can see it's downward sloping. And we can immediately recognize what this is. If this is price on the vertical axis, which is same as average revenue, and this is quantity on the horizontal axis, this average revenue curve, is actually the firm's demand curve. So it's telling you the consumer's behavior. From the perspective of the firm, however, it's interested in thinking of this as average revenue, that is, revenue per unit sold. What about the marginal revenue? Marginal revenue, just like marginal cost, is referring to the revenue generated by selling an additional unit of output. So when we talk about marginal revenue, we're talking about the revenue earned by selling, for example, the third unit. How much revenue was generated by selling the 5th unit, or the 18th unit, or whatever. Not how much revenue is generated by selling 20 units, but the 20th unit. So how do we calculate that? Well, the marginal revenue is going to be the change in the total revenue due to selling an additional unit of output. We can calculate it simply by the change in total revenue, delta means change in total revenue due to, or over, the change in output. That is, in this case, 1. Here's our table. Marginal revenue is going to be the change in the total revenue divided by the change in output. So when we do that, we can see the marginal revenue for each level of output, for each unit of output, I should say. So for example, if we're going from 0 to 1 units, the increase in total revenue over the increase in output of 1 gives us marginal revenue of $435. That is, the first unit will generate $435 of revenue. If we were looking at, say, increasing output from the 7th to the 8th unit, so how much revenue does the 8th unit generate? Change in total revenue due to change in output up to the 8th unit. So the 8th unit generated $225 in revenue. So this is the marginal revenue of the 8th unit. And if we move from the, for example, the 12th to the 13th unit, how much revenue was generated by the 13th unit? Well, we went from $3,240 to $3,315. So revenue increased by $75 due to producing and selling the 13th unit. The 13th unit's marginal revenue was $75. So let's see that on a graph. Here's our average revenue curve, which we've already calculated, which is also a demand curve we now know. And let's now put in the marginal revenue. So when we plot the marginal revenue curve, that is the revenue generated by each additional unit being sold, we can see we've got this downward sloping curve like this. And what we notice is that this curve, this marginal revenue curve, is twice as steep as the average revenue curve. That is, marginal revenue falls twice as much as average revenue falls as output increases. What if we were dealing with a price taker instead of a price maker? Price taker here is, that should be a dollar sign, not a 4. The price taker is a firm which simply accepts whatever the market price is for any output that any quantity of output that it produces and sells. In this case, we're saying that the price and therefore the revenue per unit or average revenue is $350. How do we calculate the marginal revenue? Again, the change in total revenue over the change in output. Voila. Okay, so you can see something interesting is happening here. Interesting, of course, is a relative term, but anyway. So we get an increase in total revenue of $350. Output goes up by 1. So the revenue generated by the first unit is $350. The revenue generated by producing just the 8th unit, moving from the 7th to the 8th, is again $350. Increasing output from the 12th to the 13th unit means that total revenue increases from $4,200 to $4,550, which is an increase of $350. Okay, so what's the interesting thing we notice here? That when the firm is a price taker, and so the price is unchanged, and therefore the average revenue is unchanged, the marginal revenue is equal to the average revenue or price. If we drew that on a graph, we'd have, well, this is the curve for average revenue, and it's also the curve for the marginal revenue. our rule that the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep as the demand curve, or twice as steep as the average revenue curve, still holds. That rule still holds. However, as we can see, the average revenue curve's slope is 0. It's flat. So the marginal revenue curve will also double 0 is 0. So the marginal revenue curve will also be flat. It starts at the same point, but since the curve doesn't slope downwards for average revenue, the marginal revenue curve never slopes downwards either. So they track each other. So we can say that when the firm is a price taker, when the price is unchanged no matter how much output it produces, then we say that average revenue and marginal revenue are equal at every level of output.